I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're serving tables, polishing glasses, or waiting for someone to say thank you. It doesn't matter what time it is, but I promise, today's story will shake your heart. Picture this: a man standing in a lavish New York hotel lobby, his face red with anger, yelling at a waitress over a towel stained from a mere accident. The tension in the room is sharp enough to cut. Then, just 15 minutes later, everything changes. That same waitress would be the only one who could save his life. Her name was Maria Santos, and she moved through the Grand Metropolitan Hotel like a ghost in white, her worn sneakers silent against the marble floors that reflected more wealth than she'd ever seen in her small Ohio hometown. The morning light filtered through the towering windows of the Midtown Manhattan Hotel, casting golden rectangles across the breakfast service area where she worked. The scent of fresh coffee mingled with the delicate aroma of imported pastries, creating an atmosphere of luxury that felt foreign against her calloused hands. Maria's fingers worked with practiced precision, clearing tables where guests had left behind remnants of lives she could only imagine. Business cards from investment firms, phones buzzing with stock alerts, conversations about cryptocurrency portfolios that contained more money than her family had ever dreamed possible. She listened without listening, seeing without being seen, her presence as essential yet invisible as the air these wealthy guests breathed. The ballroom gleamed with polished marble and sparkling chandeliers, each crystal catching light like captured stars. Yet Maria's world was painted with shadows no riches could erase. The fluorescent lights of the service kitchen cast harsh shadows under her eyes, revealing the exhaustion that had become her constant companion. Her uniform, pressed and clean despite its age, carried the weight of sleepless nights and mounting bills that followed her like storm clouds. She gave everything, her patience, her smile, her very self, to people who looked through her as if she were made of glass. At 28, Maria carried herself with a quiet dignity that spoke of struggles overcome and battles fought in silence. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple bun, a few rebellious strands framing a face that held both gentleness and determination. When she smiled at guests, it wasn't the manufactured brightness of customer service. It was genuine warmth, the kind that came from understanding what it meant to need kindness and rarely receive it. The morning rush was building, and Maria found herself in the hotel's executive lounge, a sanctuary of leather and mahogany where the city's elite gathered to discuss deals worth millions, while she refilled their coffee cups and cleared their plates. The conversations flowed around her like water around a stone. Talk of mergers and acquisitions, investment returns that could fund small towns, Bitcoin transactions that happened with casual finger taps on phones worth more than her monthly rent. Maria had learned to navigate this world of extreme wealth with careful steps, understanding that one wrong move, one misplaced word, could cost her the job she desperately needed. But today felt different. Today, the weight of invisibility pressed heavier on her shoulders, and the contrast between their careless abundance and her careful survival felt sharper than usual. The clock above the service station ticked toward 9 a.m., marking another hour in a day that had begun before dawn and would end long after sunset. Maria wiped down the last table in her section, her movements automatic after 2 years of repetition, when she noticed the stain on the white towel she'd just used, a small reddish mark that seemed to mock her efforts at perfection. Life behind the apron had taught Maria lessons no classroom could provide. She had arrived in New York on a Greyhound bus 2 years earlier, carrying everything she owned in a single duffel bag and her heart full of dreams that seemed both impossible and necessary. The city had welcomed her with indifference, its towering buildings and rushing crowds as overwhelming as they were inspiring. Her morning routine began at 4:30 a.m. in her studio apartment in Queens, a space so small that her bed doubled as her couch, and her kitchen table was a fold-down shelf attached to the wall. The building was old, with thin walls that carried the sounds of her neighbors' lives, crying babies, late-night arguments, and the steady hum of subway trains that never truly stopped. but it was hers, paid for with tips counted carefully each night and wages that she stretched like elastic to cover rent, utilities, and the small amount she managed to send back to her sister in Ohio. The commute to Manhattan was a daily meditation in contrasts. Maria would board the packed subway car, pressed between construction workers heading to build luxury condos they'd never afford, and office workers clutching coffee cups that cost more than she made in tips on a slow day. She'd learned to find peace in these moments, watching the city wake up through scratched windows, seeing the sunrise paint the East River gold as the train carried her toward another day of serving people who lived in a completely different world. At the hotel, Maria's world was one of constant motion. The Grand Metropolitan was a universe unto itself, with its marble lobby that echoed footsteps like whispered secrets, elevators lined with mirrors that reflected wealth and worry in equal measure, and ballrooms where crystal chandeliers cast rainbow patterns on walls covered in silk wallpaper. She knew every corner, every shadow, every sound the building made as it settled into each day. Her co-workers were a mosaic of dreams and survival stories. Rosa from El Salvador, who sent money home to her 3 children, Ahmad from Bangladesh, who was studying engineering at night while working breakfast service, and Jennifer, who had been at the hotel for 15 years and moved with the efficiency of someone who had learned every shortcut and every way to avoid trouble. They shared a kinship born of similar struggles, offering each other small kindnesses when management wasn't watching, an extra dinner roll slipped into a break room bag, coverage when someone's child was sick, or simply the comfort of understanding eyes when a difficult guest left them feeling diminished. Maria's hands had grown strong from carrying heavy trays and lifting boxes of supplies. Her back ached most evenings, a reminder of the physical toll her work demanded. But it was the emotional weight that proved more challenging, the constant need to remain pleasant while being treated as part of the furniture, the skill required to anticipate needs while remaining invisible, the delicate balance of being helpful without being presumptuous. During her breaks, when she could find 15 minutes to step outside, Maria would stand on the hotel's service entrance stairs and watch the city rush by. Wall Street was only a few blocks away, and she'd see men and women in expensive suits hurrying past, their phones pressed to their ears as they discussed portfolios worth more money than her family had ever imagined. Sometimes she wondered what it would feel like to walk those streets with purpose beyond survival, to enter those glass towers as something more than a service employee. The hotel's morning service was a carefully choreographed dance where Maria had learned her steps through repetition and observation. She understood which guests preferred their coffee refilled without being asked, and which ones wanted to be left alone with their Wall Street journals. She knew that the man at table 12 always ordered the same breakfast and left exactly 20% tip, calculated to the penny, and that the woman who sat by the window was recently divorced and ate her toast in small, sad bites while scrolling through her phone. These observations had become Maria's survival skill, reading people and situations with an accuracy born of necessity. She could sense a bad mood before it erupted, could anticipate demands before they were voiced, could navigate the complex social dynamics that separated the servers from the served. It was exhausting work, requiring emotional intelligence that went unrecognized and largely uncompensated. The morning when everything changed began like any other, with Maria arriving early to set up the breakfast service. The hotel lobby was still quiet, with only the night desk clerk and a security guard present. The cleaning crew was finishing their work, and the space held that pristine calm that would soon be shattered by the day's first wave of guests. Maria liked these quiet moments. When she could move through the space without the weight of watching eyes, when she could almost pretend the beauty around her was meant for her too. The executive lounge was her first assignment, and as she arranged fresh flowers on each table, the scent of white lilies filled the air with a sweetness that reminded her of the church back home where her mother's funeral had been held. The memory came unbidden, as they often did, bringing with it the familiar ache of loss and longing. Her mother would have been proud to see her working in such a place, Maria thought, even as she understood the irony of finding pride in work that others might view as diminishment. As the morning progressed and the first guests began to arrive for breakfast, Maria slipped back into her professional persona, alert, helpful, invisible. The transformation was so complete that she sometimes wondered who she really was beneath the uniform and practiced smile. But today, as she cleared table after table, wiping away evidence of meals that cost more than she spent on food in a week, something felt different. Today, the weight of being unseen felt heavier, and the contrast between her careful economy and their casual excess felt sharper than usual. The morning sun climbed higher, slanting through the tall windows and casting everything in golden light that made the marble floors gleam and the crystal glasses sparkle. It should have been beautiful, and it was, but Maria found herself thinking about the apartment in Queens where she'd left her windows open to catch any breeze, knowing that she couldn't afford to run the air conditioning except on the hottest days. The juxtaposition of her morning, riding a crowded subway versus walking through marble lobbies, counting tips versus overhearing conversations about investment returns, created a tension that seemed to build with each passing hour. It was in this moment of internal reflection that Maria encountered the towel that would change everything. A simple white terry cloth towel meant for cleaning spills and wiping surfaces, marked with a reddish stain that seemed to symbolize all the imperfections that existed beneath the hotel's gleaming surface. The humiliation came without warning, swift and sharp as a blade. Jonathan Hayes stood in the executive lounge like a monument to controlled fury, his 6-foot frame imposing in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Maria made in 3 months. At 48, he had the bearing of a man accustomed to immediate compliance with his wishes, his silver-touched hair perfectly styled, his watch catching light with each gesture, a Patek Philippe worth more than most people's cars. His technology empire had made him one of those names that appeared in Forbes lists and Wall Street Journal articles about innovation and success. His investment portfolio included everything from traditional blue-chip stocks to cutting-edge cryptocurrency ventures, his wealth a diverse tapestry of assets that generated money even as he slept. This morning, he had already fielded calls about a merger worth $200 million, authorized a cryptocurrency trade that would net his company significant profits, and reviewed quarterly reports showing returns that exceeded projections. But success, Maria observed, had not made him kind. The stained towel lay across the marble-top table where he'd been sitting, a small imperfection in the otherwise pristine setting. Maria approached with professional composure, intending to replace it quietly, but Jonathan's voice cut through the air like breaking glass. "Excuse me," he said, his tone carrying the sharp edge of barely contained anger. "What exactly is this?" Maria looked at the towel, then at his face, reading the storm building behind his cold blue eyes. "I'm sorry, sir. Let me get you a fresh one immediately." But Jonathan wasn't finished. Something about the morning, perhaps a difficult call with his ex-wife about their children's custody schedule, or the stress of the merger negotiations, or simply the habit of wielding power because he could, had left him looking for a target for his frustration. "You're not family," he said, his voice rising enough to draw attention from nearby tables. "How hard is it to keep a simple towel clean? Is basic competence too much to expect anymore?" The words hit Maria like physical blows. Around them, the quiet breakfast conversations paused, guests lifting their eyes from newspapers and phones to witness the scene. The morning light that had seemed golden moments before now felt harsh, exposing her embarrassment for all to see. Her cheeks flushed, not from shame, but from the exhaustion of bearing such moments with dignity she wasn't sure she possessed. "I apologize, sir," Maria said quietly, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt inside. "I'll replace it right away." Jonathan's anger seemed to feed on her quiet response, as if her refusal to fight back somehow justified his escalation. This is exactly the problem with service today. No attention to detail, no pride in work, Do you understand that some of us are conducting important business here? That a simple mistake like this reflects on the entire establishment? Each word was carefully chosen to wound, designed to make her feel small and incompetent. Maria stood perfectly still, her hands folded in front of her, offering no defense that might further inflame his anger. She had learned this survival technique years ago: how to become smaller, how to absorb hostility without reflecting it back, how to protect herself by offering no resistance to the storm. But inside, her heart raced with a complex mixture of emotions. Shame battled with anger, hurt warred with pride. She wanted to tell him that she had been up since before dawn, that she worked harder in a single shift than most people worked in a week, that her attention to detail was what kept her employed, despite her lack of connections or advantages. She wanted to explain that the stain wasn't her fault, that it had been there when she found the towel, that she was simply trying to do her job with the dignity she maintained like armor against exactly this kind of assault. Instead, she said simply, "Yes, sir. I understand." The other guests had become an audience now, some looking uncomfortable with the scene, others seeming to enjoy the spectacle of authority asserting itself over service. Maria felt their eyes like weights, each gaze adding to the burden of public humiliation. This wasn't just about a towel anymore. It was about class, power, and the invisible lines that separated people like her from people like him. Jonathan seemed to realize he had an audience, and perhaps that realization should have tempered his anger. Instead, it seemed to feed it. "I don't think you do understand," he continued, his voice carrying clearly across the lounge. "When someone pays for excellence, they expect to receive it, not excuses, not incompetence disguised as effort." Maria's supervisor, Jennifer, appeared as if summoned by some internal radar that experienced service workers developed for sensing trouble. She approached with the careful steps of someone walking through a minefield, her practiced smile masking the calculation happening behind her eyes. "Mr. Hayes," Jennifer said smoothly, "I apologize for any inconvenience. Maria is one of our most reliable staff members, and I'm certain this was simply an oversight." But Jonathan's anger had found its target, and he wasn't ready to be redirected. "Then perhaps your standards for reliability need adjustment," he replied coldly. "This kind of carelessness is unacceptable in an establishment of this caliber." The words hung in the air like smoke, poisoning the atmosphere with their cruelty. Maria felt something break inside her, not her spirit, but her faith in the basic kindness she had always believed existed in people, even difficult ones. She realized in that moment that to him, she wasn't a person at all. She was simply an object that had failed to function properly, deserving of public correction and dismissal. The silence that followed felt eternal, stretching across the lounge like a held breath. Other guests pretended to return to their newspapers and conversations, but the tension remained palpable. Maria stood in the center of it all, maintaining her composure through sheer force of will, waiting for permission to disappear back into the invisibility that had protected her until now. Finally, Jonathan waved his hand dismissively. "Just replace it, and let's move on," he said, already turning his attention back to his phone as if she had ceased to exist the moment his proclamation was complete. Maria nodded once, collected the offending towel, and walked toward the service doors with measured steps. Only when she reached the safety of the service corridor did she allow herself to lean against the wall and close her eyes, fighting back tears that came not from sadness, but from the pure exhaustion of maintaining dignity in the face of deliberate cruelty. She didn't know that 15 minutes later, her quiet strength and hidden preparation would save the life of the man who had just treated her as less than human. She didn't know that this moment of humiliation was about to transform into something that would challenge everything both of them believed about worth, value, and the true meaning of service. All she knew was that her hands were shaking as she reached for a fresh towel, and that the marble floors of the Grand Metropolitan Hotel had never felt colder beneath her feet. The breaking point came not with thunder, but with the whispered cruelty of constant erosion. Maria stood in the service corridor, her back pressed against the cool wall, trying to gather herself after the public humiliation in the lounge. The fresh towel felt heavy in her hands, weighted not with fabric, but with the accumulated burden of every dismissive glance, every demanding tone, every moment she had been treated as part of the scenery rather than a human being. Through the service doors, she could hear the normal sounds of breakfast continuing, the gentle clink of silverware against china, the murmur of important conversations about stock portfolios and real estate investments, the comfortable laughter of people whose biggest worry was which luxury restaurant to choose for dinner. The contrast between their ease and her distress felt like a physical weight on her chest. Jennifer found her there, concern creasing her experienced features. At 52, Jennifer had seen enough scenes like the one that had just unfolded to recognize the particular kind of damage they could inflict on someone like Maria, someone who still carried hope that hard work and kindness would eventually be recognized and rewarded. "Hey," Jennifer said softly, placing a gentle hand on Maria's shoulder. "Don't let him get to you. Men like that, they're fighting battles that have nothing to do with us. We're just convenient targets." Maria nodded, but the gesture felt hollow. She understood the logic of Jennifer's reassurance, but understanding didn't ease the sting of being berated in front of strangers, didn't diminish the feeling that she had somehow failed at the basic task of being invisible and efficient. "I know," Maria whispered, her voice barely audible above the distant sounds of the hotel's morning symphony. I thought I was getting better at this, at reading people, at anticipating problems before they happened." Jennifer's expression softened with recognition of a struggle she knew intimately. "You are good at this, Maria. You're one of the best we have. But some people, they need someone to blame for all the things in their life they can't control. Has nothing to do with your work and everything to do with their own problems." The wisdom in Jennifer's words was born of 15 years navigating the complex dynamics between staff and guests, 15 years of absorbing the frustrations of people whose wealth hadn't transformed their fundamental human struggles. She had seen marriages crumble at breakfast tables, where couples argued over prenups worth millions, had watched business deals fall apart over handshake meetings in the executive lounge, had observed the particular loneliness that seemed to follow extreme wealth like a shadow. But for Maria, the intellectual understanding of Jonathan's behavior didn't ease its emotional impact. She had grown up believing that if she worked hard enough, if she was kind enough, if she gave enough of herself to others, she would eventually find her place in the world, a place where her contributions were valued and her presence was welcomed rather than merely tolerated. "Take a few minutes," Jennifer said, checking her watch. "I'll handle the lounge until you're ready." Maria appreciated the kindness, but she also knew that in their world of tight schedules and careful staffing, every moment away from her duties created ripples that affected everyone. She straightened her shoulders, smoothed her uniform, and prepared to return to the dining room, carrying the fresh towel like a flag of surrender. As she pushed through the service doors, Maria caught sight of Jonathan Hayes across the lounge, his attention fully absorbed by his phone screen. He was scrolling through what appeared to be financial reports, his expression focused and intense. The scene from 15 minutes earlier might never have happened, erased from his memory as completely as if it had been deleted from a computer hard drive. But Maria remembered every word, every gesture, every moment of standing in the center of that room while strangers watched her be diminished. The memory would stay with her long after his anger had dissolved into whatever new concern demanded his attention. She approached his table with careful steps, hyper-aware of every movement, every potential for a mistake that might reignite his anger. The replacement towel was spotless, folded with the precise care she brought to every aspect of her work, but she found herself questioning whether it was perfect enough, whether some invisible flaw might trigger another public correction. Jonathan didn't look up as she placed the fresh towel beside his coffee cup and removed the stained one. His fingers moved across his phone screen with practiced efficiency, responding to messages about cryptocurrency trades and investment opportunities that would happen with casual ease. His morning included decisions that involved more money than most people earned in lifetimes, transactions that occurred with the simple tap of a screen. For a moment, Maria stood beside the table, invisible and forgotten, watching this man whose anger had shaken her confidence so thoroughly. She observed the tension in his shoulders, the tight line of his jaw, the way his eyes moved across the screen with the intensity of someone carrying immense responsibility. Perhaps Jennifer was right. Perhaps his anger had nothing to do with her and everything to do with pressures she couldn't imagine. But understanding didn't equal forgiveness, and observation didn't erase humiliation. Maria turned to leave, accepting that this encounter would become another story she'd carry silently. Another lesson in the careful art of being present but invisible, useful but unremarkable. She had no way of knowing that in 15 minutes everything would change, that the man who had dismissed her worth so casually would find himself entirely dependent on skills she had gained not from formal training, but from the same determination to better herself that brought her to the city. She couldn't predict that the breaking point she felt now would give way to a moment of crisis that would redefine both their understanding of value and service. The hotel lobby stretched before her like a marble ocean, its polished surfaces reflecting the morning light that painted everything in golden hues. The grandfather clock near the concierge desk began its ritual marking of the hour, its deep chimes echoing through the space with solemn regularity. 9:15 a.m., the clock announced, and Maria walked toward her next responsibility, carrying the stained towel and the weight of maintaining dignity in a world that seemed determined to test it at every turn. Behind her, Jonathan Hayes continued scrolling through his phone, unaware that he was about to learn the difference between the price of service and its true value, between the power of wealth and the strength of compassion, between the crushing weight of authority and the subtle force of grace under pressure. The morning light shifted, casting new shadows across the marble floor, and Maria Santos walked forward into a future she couldn't yet imagine. Carrying within her the quiet strength that would soon prove more valuable than all the cryptocurrency portfolios and investment returns in Jonathan Hayes's considerable financial empire. The collapse happened with shocking suddenness, transforming the elegant morning into chaos within the span of a heartbeat. Jonathan Hayes had been standing near the lobby's reception area, still absorbed in his phone screen where market numbers danced in green and red columns when the first wave of pain struck his chest like lightning. The phone fell from his fingers, clattering against the marble floors. His hand flew to his chest, clutching at his shirt, as if he could somehow grab hold of the pain and pull it out. His face went pale, then gray, sweat appearing on his forehead despite the hotel's perfectly controlled climate. The confidence and authority that had defined him minutes earlier evaporated, replaced by the raw terror of a man suddenly confronted with his own mortality. "Help!" he gasped, but the word came out as barely more than a whisper, lost in the vastness of the lobby where conversations continued their normal rhythm, where guests moved through their morning routines, unaware that someone was fighting for his life just steps away. Jonathan's legs gave out, and he collapsed onto the cold marble floor, his expensive suit offering him no protection against the unforgiving surface. The sound of his fall, a dull thud followed by the scatter of coins from his pocket, finally drew attention from nearby guests. But their initial reaction was confusion rather than recognition of emergency, uncertainty about whether to intervene or maintain the polite distance that governed interactions in such settings. A woman gasped, her coffee cup rattling against its saucer as she set it down too quickly. A businessman looked up from his Wall Street Journal, his expression shifting from annoyance at the disturbance to growing concern as he recognized the signs of medical crisis. The hotel's marble surfaces, designed to convey luxury and permanence, suddenly seemed cold and hostile, reflecting the harsh fluorescent emergency lighting that automatically engaged when the security desk registered distress. Maria had been 3 tables away when she heard the commotion, turning to see the gathering crowd around something she couldn't yet identify. Her first instinct was professional, to stay out of the way, to let the appropriate authorities handle whatever situation was developing. She moved closer and saw Jonathan Hayes on the floor, his body convulsing with the effort to breathe. Every other consideration fell away. Time seemed to slow and accelerate simultaneously. Maria registered the scene with the hyper-awareness that comes with adrenaline, the guests stepping back uncertainly, the security guard speaking rapidly into his radio, the desk clerk fumbling with the phone to call for emergency services. But most clearly, she saw Jonathan's face, transformed from arrogance to vulnerability, his eyes wide with fear as he struggled against the pain that had brought him down. Without hesitation, Maria dropped to her knees beside him, her hands moving with surprising steadiness for someone whose heart was racing. The marble was cold against her knees through her uniform, but she barely noticed. Her training kicked in, not formal training from an expensive course, but knowledge she had gained from online videos during her breaks, studying CPR techniques on her phone because she had promised herself she would be prepared if someone ever needed help. The irony wasn't lost on her even in that moment of crisis, that she was rushing to save the man who had publicly humiliated her just minutes before. But the woman who knelt on that marble floor wasn't thinking about justice or revenge or even the bitter satisfaction of moral superiority. She was thinking about preserving life, about the fundamental human obligation to help when help is needed, regardless of who needs it or how they've treated you. "Sir, can you hear me?" Maria asked. Her voice calm despite the chaos around them. Jonathan's eyes found hers, and she saw recognition flash across his features, recognition not just of her face, but of the cruel irony of their situation. He tried to speak, but the words came out as gasps. Maria leaned closer, assessing his condition with the careful attention she brought to every task. His pulse was rapid and irregular, his breathing shallow and labored. She had learned enough from her self-directed study to recognize the signs of cardiac distress, to understand that the next few minutes would determine whether this man lived or died. The crowd around them grew larger, but remained at a respectful distance, their voices creating a low murmur of concern and speculation. Someone mentioned calling 911. Another voice suggested finding a doctor among the hotel guests. But Maria was already moving beyond suggestions to action. "I need everyone to step back, please," she said with quiet authority, surprising herself with how naturally command came to her in this moment. "Give him room to breathe." Her hands moved to Jonathan's chest, positioning themselves with the precision she had practiced during countless break times, watching instructional videos on her phone while eating quick lunches in the staff room. The knowledge had been theoretical then, something she hoped never to need but wanted to possess just in case. Now, with someone's life literally in her hands, the theory became crucial reality. Maria began chest compressions, counting under her breath as she pushed against Jonathan's sternum with the measured rhythm she had memorized. The force required surprised her. The videos hadn't conveyed how much pressure was necessary, how the body would resist even life-saving intervention. But she maintained the rhythm, her arms already beginning to ache with the effort. Jonathan's son David had been crossing the lobby when the crisis began, returning from a morning meeting with his father about expanding their tech company's cryptocurrency investments. At 25, David carried the confident bearing of someone born into wealth but hadn't yet developed the casual cruelty that seemed to come with wielding power. When he saw the crowd gathered around a fallen figure, his first concern was professional politeness, another guest in distress, something the hotel staff would handle efficiently. But as he pushed through the crowd and saw his father on the floor, with Maria kneeling beside him performing CPR, David's world shifted on its axis. The woman his father had berated minutes earlier was now fighting to save his life, her hands working with steady determination as she breathed life back into the man who had treated her as less than human. The paradox struck David with almost physical force. He watched Maria's face, seeing the concentration and compassion that drove her actions, understanding that she was giving everything she had to preserve the life of someone who had shown her no kindness. There was no hesitation in her movements, no moment where she considered whether Jonathan Hayes deserved her help. She simply helped because helping was who she was. Emergency sirens began to wail in the distance, growing closer with each passing second. The sound cut through the hotel's usual atmosphere of muffled luxury, reminding everyone present that life and death followed no social conventions, respected no class boundaries. Maria continued her compressions, sweat appearing on her forehead from the physical exertion, her breathing becoming labored as she poured her strength into keeping Jonathan alive. The paramedics arrived with professional efficiency, their equipment and expertise immediately taking command of the situation. They praised Maria's quick action, noting that her CPR had likely prevented brain damage during the critical minutes before their arrival. As they prepared Jonathan for transport, working with the smooth coordination of people who faced such crises daily, Maria stepped back into the crowd, suddenly aware that she was shaking. The lobby seemed different now, charged with the electricity of emergency and the strange intimacy that comes when strangers witness someone fighting for life. Guests who had been absorbed in their newspapers and business calls now found themselves part of something larger, connected by the shared experience of seeing human fragility laid bare against the marble floors of assumed permanence. As the paramedics wheeled Jonathan toward the ambulance, David caught Maria's arm gently. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for helping him after what happened earlier." Maria looked at him with tired eyes that held no judgment, no expectation of gratitude or acknowledgement. "I hope he'll be okay," she said simply, and David realized that her concern was genuine, that she held no resentment even after being publicly humiliated by the man she had just saved. The ambulance pulled away, its sirens fading into the normal sounds of New York City traffic, leaving behind a hotel lobby that looked the same but felt fundamentally changed. The marble floors had been cleaned, the crowd had dispersed, and the morning service had resumed its normal rhythm. But something had shifted in the careful balance between server and served, something that would ripple through the lives of everyone who had witnessed a moment when dignity and compassion proved more powerful than wealth and status. Maria returned to her duties with shaking hands, but her spirit felt oddly calm. She had done what needed to be done, had responded to crisis with the strength she had cultivated through years of difficulty and service. She didn't know yet how this moment would change her life, didn't realize that she had just demonstrated a kind of value that couldn't be measured in stock portfolios or cryptocurrency holdings. All she knew was that someone had needed help, and she had been able to provide it. In a world that often made her feel invisible and insignificant, that knowledge felt like a small victory, a reminder of her own worth that no amount of public humiliation could diminish. The grandfather clock in the lobby chimed the half hour, marking the passage of time with its steady rhythm, indifferent to the drama that had unfolded beneath its face. Life continued, service resumed, but something fundamental had changed in the space between heartbeats. In the moment when a humble waitress had proven that true service had nothing to do with subservience and everything to do with the courage to act with compassion when compassion was needed most. The silence that followed Jonathan's departure felt different from the usual quiet efficiency of hotel operations. It was the kind of silence that settles over a place after something profound has occurred, when the ordinary rhythms of daily life must somehow accommodate the memory of extraordinary moments. The Grand Metropolitan Hotel continued its practiced dance of luxury service, but underneath the polished routines, something had shifted. Maria found herself moving through her duties with unusual self-awareness, as if seeing her work through new eyes. The other guests looked at her differently now, not with the casual dismissal she had grown accustomed to, but with a kind of curious respect. Word had spread quickly through the hotel's social networks, as dramatic news always does in contained spaces where people have little to occupy their attention beyond each other's business. The executive lounge where her public humiliation had occurred now felt charged with different energy. Guests who had witnessed the earlier scene between Maria and Jonathan seemed uncomfortable, their conversations more muted than usual, their interactions with staff notably more polite. It was as if they had all been forced to confront the uncomfortable reality that the people serving them were fully human, capable of both suffering and grace in ways that their own wealth and status hadn't prepared them to recognize. Jennifer found Maria during the lunch preparation, studying her with the concerned attention of someone who had seen enough workplace drama to recognize when an employee was processing something significant. "You okay?" she asked quietly, checking the service area to ensure they wouldn't be overheard. Maria paused in folding napkins, her hands stilling as she considered the question. "I think so," she said finally. "It's just strange, you know. 1 minute he was... and then I was trying to save his life. It doesn't feel real." Jennifer nodded with the understanding of someone who had witnessed the full spectrum of human behavior in service industries. "That's the thing about emergencies," she said. "They strip away all the pretense pretty quickly. Show you what people are really made of." The implication hung between them, that Maria had revealed something about herself that went far beyond her job description, far beyond the role of invisible service provider that the hotel expected her to fill. She had acted with a kind of moral courage that commanded respect, regardless of uniforms or social status. Throughout the afternoon, Maria became aware of whispered conversations that stopped when she approached tables, of glances that carried curiosity rather than indifference. The transformation in how she was perceived felt surreal, as if she had somehow become visible overnight after 2 years of careful invisibility. David Hayes returned to the hotel that evening, exhaustion etched in his young features. His father was stable but would require surgery, the doctors had explained, a procedure made possible largely because Maria's quick intervention had prevented the kind of brain damage that often accompanies cardiac events. David had spent the day in sterile waiting rooms, watching monitors and trying to process the strange turn of events that had brought his family to this moment. He found Maria in the service corridor, taking a brief break between dinner preparations. She looked up as he approached, her expression neutral but not unkind, waiting to see what this conversation might bring. "The doctors said your CPR probably saved his life," David said without preamble, his voice hoarse with the strain of the day. "They said most people would have panicked or waited for professionals, but you acted immediately." Maria absorbed this information quietly. "I'm glad he's going to be okay," she said simply. David studied her face, searching for some sign of the satisfaction or vindication that he thought he might feel in her position. But Maria's expression held only genuine concern, the same compassion she had shown while kneeling on the marble floor performing chest compressions on a man who had treated her cruelly. "Why?" David asked finally. "After what he said to you this morning, after the way he treated you in front of everyone, why did you help him?" The question seemed to surprise Maria, as if she had never considered any other response possible. "Because he needed help," she said, her voice carrying the simple certainty of someone stating an obvious truth. When someone is dying, nothing else matters. Her answer revealed something that David was only beginning to understand about the nature of service, about the difference between being forced to serve and choosing to care for others. Maria's actions hadn't been driven by job requirements or fear of supervisors. They had come from a moral compass that functioned independently of how she was treated, that responded to need rather than merit. The hotel around them continued its evening routines, but the conversation in that service corridor was quietly rewriting the rules of engagement between staff and guests, between server and served. David found himself seeing Maria not as a waitress who happened to know CPR, but as a person whose character had been revealed under pressure. who had chosen compassion over resentment when faced with the ultimate test of her values. As days passed, the story of what had happened spread beyond the hotel's walls. Social media posts from guests who had witnessed the scene began circulating, mostly focusing on the dramatic irony of the situation, but gradually expanding to include recognition of Maria's grace under pressure. Local news outlets picked up the story, drawn by the compelling contrast between wealth and humility, between public humiliation and private heroism. But for Maria, the attention felt uncomfortable and strange. She had never sought recognition for doing what seemed right, had never considered that her actions might be newsworthy or inspiring. The reporters who called the hotel asking for interviews found her reluctant to speak, more comfortable returning to the familiar rhythms of service than discussing what she had done or why. The Grand Metropolitan's management found themselves in an unusual position. The incident had generated the kind of publicity that could be either beneficial or damaging, depending on how it was handled. There were discussions about public relations opportunities, about ways to capitalize on the positive aspects of the story while avoiding any implications of poor treatment of staff. Maria remained largely separate from these calculations, continuing her work with the same quiet efficiency that had defined her employment from the beginning. But she was aware of subtle changes. Conversations that stopped when she entered rooms, glances that lingered with curiosity or respect. A general sense that her presence somehow meant more than it had before. The absence of Jonathan Hayes from the hotel's daily rhythms created its own kind of silence. The executive lounge felt different without his commanding presence, without the tension that had surrounded his high-stakes phone calls and demanding expectations. Other guests filled the space, but none carried quite the same atmosphere of barely controlled intensity that had characterized Jonathan's morning routines. Maria found herself thinking about him during quiet moments, wondering about his recovery, hoping that the crisis had passed without permanent damage. She felt no particularly complex emotions about their earlier encounter, no need for revenge or vindication, no expectation of apology or acknowledgement. She had done what needed to be done when it needed to be done, and that felt complete in itself. The story would continue to unfold in ways she couldn't yet imagine, but for now, Maria Santos moved through her days with the same careful attention to service that had always defined her work, carrying within her the quiet knowledge that when crisis had demanded the best of her character, she had been able to respond with grace, compassion, and the kind of moral courage that transforms ordinary moments into something approaching heroism. The silence of Jonathan's absence was about to be broken by revelations that would challenge everything both he and Maria understood about the nature of service, dignity, and what it truly means to save someone's life. The revelation came through channels as unexpected as they were illuminating, beginning with a security footage review that nobody had anticipated would become significant. 3 weeks after Jonathan's cardiac episode, the Grand Metropolitan's risk management team was conducting a routine analysis of the incident, primarily concerned with liability issues and insurance claims related to medical emergencies on hotel property. What they discovered changed everything. The high-definition security cameras positioned throughout the executive lounge had captured not just Jonathan's collapse and Maria's life-saving response, but the entire sequence of events that preceded the crisis. Frame by frame, the footage revealed a story more complex and damaging than anyone had realized. The towel that had triggered Jonathan's public tirade against Maria was clearly visible in the recordings, and the stain that had served as justification for his humiliating outburst was documented with crystal clarity. But the cameras also showed something else. The towel had been pristine when Maria first handled it. The reddish mark that Jonathan had used as evidence of her incompetence had appeared only after he himself had knocked over a small vial of prescription medication, spilling its contents across the white terry cloth. The security team watched in uncomfortable silence as the footage showed Jonathan's reaction to his own accident, not acknowledgement or self-correction, but an almost immediate decision to blame Maria for the mess he had created. The cameras captured him straightening the medication bottle and pushing it aside before calling her over to berate her for the stain he had caused. But the revelation that truly shocked the security team came later in the footage, when they realized that Maria's CPR certification wasn't as recent or casual as everyone had assumed. The cameras had inadvertently recorded her during break periods over the past several months, studying medical emergency procedures on her phone with the focused intensity of someone preparing for examinations. Further investigation revealed that Maria had been systematically educating herself in emergency response techniques for over a year, motivated by the death of a childhood friend who had suffered a cardiac event with no one around who knew how to help. She had spent her own money on online courses, had practiced techniques during her limited free time, had prepared herself to save lives not because it was required by her job, but because she believed it was her moral obligation to be ready if someone needed help. The footage painted a picture that contradicted every assumption that had been made about the events of that morning. Maria hadn't been a minimally trained waitress who happened to know basic CPR. She had been someone who had deliberately acquired advanced life-saving skills, who had been carrying the emotional weight of preventable tragedy, and who had responded to Jonathan's crisis with expertise she had earned through dedication and personal sacrifice. David Hayes was the first family member to see the security footage, called in by the hotel's management as they grappled with the implications of what they had discovered. Watching his father's behavior on the screen, seeing the calculated cruelty of blaming Maria for his own mistake, witnessing the public humiliation he had inflicted on someone whose only crime had been trying to do her job, David felt physically sick. The irony was almost unbearable. The woman his father had berated for incompetence and lack of attention, to detail had been preparing herself to save lives with a level of dedication that put most medical professionals to shame. The person he had dismissed as unworthy of basic respect had possessed the skills and character to preserve his life when his own arrogance and stress had brought him to the edge of death. But there was more. The hotel's investigation had uncovered additional details about Maria's background that painted an even more complex picture of the woman who had knelt on marble floors to perform chest compressions on someone who had treated her cruelly. Immigration records showed that she had arrived in New York carrying debt from her mother's medical bills, that she was supporting not only herself, but contributing to her sister's education and her father's care in an assisted living facility in Ohio. Financial records, obtained with Maria's permission as part of the hotel's review, revealed the careful economy with which she managed her life. Every dollar was allocated with precision, whether for rent, utilities, family support, or the small amounts she set aside for her continuing education in emergency medical techniques. The contrast between her careful stewardship of limited resources and Jonathan's casual spending on luxury items created a moral framework that made his treatment of her even more difficult to justify. The investigation also revealed something that surprised even Maria's longtime colleagues. She had been quietly intervening in medical emergencies for months before Jonathan's cardiac episode. Hotel records showed 3 separate incidents where she had provided first aid to guests: an elderly woman who had fallen in the bathroom, a businessman who had suffered what appeared to be a minor stroke during breakfast, and a tourist who had experienced a severe allergic reaction in the lobby. In each case, Maria had responded quickly and competently, providing care that had prevented more serious consequences. But in each case, she had also stepped back once professional medical help arrived, returning to her regular duties without seeking recognition or credit for her interventions. The pattern revealed someone who had made emergency response a personal mission, who had transformed her own experience with medical tragedy into a commitment to ensuring that others wouldn't face the same helplessness. Jennifer, who had worked alongside Maria for 2 years, was stunned by these revelations. She never said anything, she told the investigators, never mentioned the training, never asked for time off to study, never made it seem like she was doing anything beyond her regular job. I knew she was special, but I had no idea how special. The security footage also captured another significant detail that had been overlooked in the chaos of the emergency. Jonathan's phone, which had fallen from his hands during the cardiac episode, had been displaying a cryptocurrency trading app showing transactions worth several $100,000. The casual nature of his financial activities, the way he'd been conducting business worth more than most people's annual salaries while dismissing Maria's worth as a human being, created a stark illustration of the moral distance between them. As the investigation continued, it became clear that this wasn't just a story about a medical emergency or workplace conflict. It was a story about assumptions, about the invisible work that people like Maria performed not just as employees, but as human beings committed to caring for others, despite receiving little care themselves. The hotel's management faced a complex decision about what to do with this information. The security footage provided clear evidence that Jonathan had falsely blamed Maria for his own mistake, that he had publicly humiliated someone who didn't deserve such treatment, and that the person he had dismissed as incompetent had possessed skills and character that far exceeded anything that could have been expected from her job description. But they also realized that Maria herself remained unaware of what the investigation had revealed. She'd continued working throughout the week since Jonathan's emergency, never knowing that clear evidence existed to vindicate her, never demanding correction of the record or acknowledgement of the injustice she had suffered. The revelation was about to transform not only how everyone understood what had happened that morning, but also how they understood Maria herself, not as a fortunate waitress who happened to know CPR, but as a deeply committed person who had systematically prepared herself to serve others in the most fundamental way possible, and who had done so despite being treated with a callousness that should have destroyed her faith in the goodness of the people she served. The truth was finally ready to emerge, carrying with it the power to rewrite assumptions about service, dignity, and the complex relationship between those who serve and those who are served. The reunion came not with fanfare, but with the quiet gravity of someone finally ready to confront the weight of truth. Jonathan Hayes returned to the Grand Metropolitan Hotel 6 weeks after his cardiac episode. His recovery marked not just by the physical healing of his heart, but by a transformation that went far deeper than medical intervention could achieve. The man who walked through the marble lobby bore little resemblance to the commanding figure who had collapsed on those same floors weeks earlier. His stride was slower, more thoughtful, his expression carrying the particular kind of humility that comes from having confronted mortality. The expensive suit remained, the careful grooming was still evident, but something fundamental had changed in how he carried himself through spaces where his wealth had once granted automatic authority. David had prepared his father for what the security footage revealed, had shown him the clear evidence of his own mistake and the calculated cruelty of his response. Watching himself on the screen had been more devastating for Jonathan than any medical crisis, seeing his behavior through objective eyes, witnessing the deliberate nature of his public humiliation of someone who had done nothing wrong. But learning about Maria's background, about her systematic preparation to save lives, and her pattern of quiet intervention in medical emergencies, had shaken him even more profoundly. The woman he had dismissed as incompetent had been operating at a level of moral and professional commitment that he was only beginning to understand. Jonathan found Maria in the service corridor during the afternoon shift change, the same location where she had taken refuge after his public tirade weeks earlier. She looked up as he approached, her expression wary but not hostile. Carrying the careful neutrality of someone who had learned to protect herself from unpredictable authority. "Maria," he said simply, and something in his voice, a quality of vulnerability she hadn't heard before, made her pause in folding the linens she had been organizing. They stood in the narrow corridor with the sounds of hotel operations continuing around them, the distant clatter of dishes being prepared for dinner service, the muffled conversations of guests moving through nearby areas, the steady hum of climate control systems maintaining perfect comfort in spaces designed for others. But in that moment, the corridor felt like its own world, separated from the public performances that both of them had been maintaining. "I know what really happened," Jonathan said, his voice carrying none of the commanding authority she remembered from their previous encounter. "With the towel, with the stain. I know it was my fault, and I know I blamed you for my own mistake." Maria absorbed this admission quietly, not demanding elaboration or justification, simply listening with the patience she had developed through years of navigating complex human dynamics in service positions. "The security cameras," Jonathan continued, his discomfort evident as he forced himself to confront the full scope of his behavior. "They showed everything. How I knocked over my medication, how I tried to blame you instead of taking responsibility, how I humiliated you in front of everyone for something I had done." The words hung between them in the fluorescent-lit corridor, creating a space where truth could exist without the distorting effects of social hierarchy or professional obligation. Maria felt something shift inside her chest, not vindication or satisfaction, but a kind of recognition that justice sometimes comes in unexpected forms. "But that's not even the worst part," Jonathan said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "The worst part is learning who you really are, what you've been doing, how wrong I was about everything." He told her what the investigation had revealed about her medical training, about her pattern of emergency interventions, about the careful way she had prepared herself to save lives despite receiving no compensation or recognition for such preparation. He spoke about the financial records that showed her supporting family members while living on carefully managed resources, about the contrast between her deliberate economy and his casual excess. "You've been serving people in ways I never understood," Jonathan said, his eyes meeting hers for what felt like the first time since they had known each other. "Not just bringing meals and clearing tables, but actually keeping people alive, actually being ready when crisis came. And I treated you like you were nothing." Maria listened to this accounting of her hidden life with surprise. She had never considered her emergency preparedness noteworthy, had never thought of her interventions as anything beyond basic human obligation. To learn that others viewed her actions as exceptional felt strange and somewhat uncomfortable. "I just did what needed to be done," she said finally, her voice carrying the same quiet certainty that had characterized her response when David had asked similar questions weeks earlier. But Jonathan was beginning to understand that this simple statement revealed something profound about Maria's character, that she defined what needed to be done in terms that extended far beyond job descriptions or social expectations, that she had systematically expanded her capabilities because she believed caring for others was a fundamental human responsibility. "No," he said gently but firmly. "You did far more than what needed to be done. You prepared for emergencies that were never part of your job. You studied medical techniques on your own time, with your own money, because you wanted to be ready to help people. You turned your own tragedy into expertise that could prevent other people's tragedies." The conversation continued in that corridor for nearly an hour, with Jonathan attempting to articulate an understanding of service and moral commitment that he had never been required to develop, and Maria slowly recognizing that her actions had been observed and evaluated in ways she hadn't realized. They talked about the morning of his cardiac episode, about the strange irony of their positions reverting so completely in such a short time, about the way crisis had stripped away all the artificial barriers between them. Jonathan described his experience of lying on the marble floor, looking up at the woman he had humiliated, and understanding that she was choosing to save his life despite having every reason to let others handle the emergency. "Why?" he asked the question his son had posed weeks earlier. "After what I had done to you, why did you help me?" Maria's answer came without hesitation, carrying the weight of conviction developed through years of hardship and service. "Because that's who I choose to be, not because of how people treat me, but because of who I am." The statement contained an entire philosophy of service and human relationship that Jonathan was only beginning to comprehend. He realized that Maria had been operating from a moral framework that made her behavior predictable and reliable, not because of training or supervision, but because she had decided what kind of person she would be and had maintained that decision regardless of external circumstances. As their conversation drew to a close, Jonathan understood that this reunion was not really an ending, but a beginning. The start of a relationship based on recognition of Maria's full humanity rather than the narrow role he had assigned her, the beginning of his own education in what service really means when it comes from choice rather than obligation. The corridor around them continued its normal functions, with staff members moving efficiently between service areas, carrying out the countless small tasks that maintained the hotel's atmosphere of seamless comfort. But something fundamental had changed in how Jonathan understood the people who performed this work, how he recognized the skill, dedication, and moral commitment that existed largely unnoticed behind the scenes of luxury service. Maria returned to her duties with a sense of completion that had nothing to do with vindication or victory, and everything to do with being seen and acknowledged as a full human being by someone who had initially viewed her as little more than a malfunctioning piece of equipment. The reunion had restored something that she hadn't realized she had lost, not just dignity, but faith in the possibility that understanding could eventually bridge even the widest gaps between different ways of living and being in the world. The redemption began not with grand gestures, but with quiet recognition, spreading outward from that corridor conversation like ripples across still water. Jonathan Hayes's transformation affected not just his relationship with Maria, but his entire understanding of the world in which he moved, the services he consumed, and the people who made his privileged life possible. Within a week of their reunion, Jonathan had initiated a comprehensive review of employment practices across all his business interests. His technology company, which employed thousands of people in various capacities from software engineering to building maintenance, became the first major corporation in the city to implement what became known as the Maria Protocol, a recognition program that identified and celebrated employees who went beyond their job descriptions to serve others. But Jonathan's personal redemption went deeper than corporate policies. He began appearing at the Grand Metropolitan Hotel not as the demanding guest who expected perfect service, but as someone learning to see the full humanity of the people who provided that service. His breakfast conversations with Maria became a regular occurrence, not social presumption, but genuine interest in understanding her perspective on work, life, and the complex dynamics of serving others. Maria found these interactions initially uncomfortable, unsure how to navigate the collapse of barriers that had previously defined their relationship. But gradually, she began to appreciate Jonathan's genuine curiosity about her experiences, his obvious effort to comprehend realities that his wealth had previously insulated him from understanding. "Tell me about the CPR training," he said during one of these breakfast conversations, his tone carrying none of the dismissive authority she remembered from their first encounter. "When did you decide that was something you needed to know?" Maria set down the coffee pot she had been holding and considered the question. They were alone in the executive lounge, the morning rush having ended, creating a space for conversation that would have been impossible weeks earlier. "When I was 16, she said slowly. "My best friend Amanda collapsed during basketball practice. Nobody knew what to do. We just stood there watching her die, waiting for the ambulance that came too late. I promised myself that if I was ever in that situation again, I would know how to help." The story revealed layers of motivation that Jonathan was only beginning to appreciate. Maria's emergency preparedness wasn't academic or professional. It was personal, driven by loss and the determination to prevent others from experiencing the helplessness she had felt watching her friend die. "So you've been studying emergency medicine for 12 years?" Jonathan asked, his voice reflecting growing understanding of the dedication such long-term commitment represented. "On and off," Maria replied. "Whenever I could afford the courses, whenever I had time between jobs and family obligations, it felt like something I owed to Amanda and to anyone who might need help when I was around." Jonathan absorbed this, realizing that the woman he had dismissed as a simple waitress had been carrying the weight of personal tragedy and transforming it into skills that could save lives. The contrast between her hidden dedication and his own casual consumption of luxury services felt increasingly stark. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of David, who had been observing his father's transformation with equal measures of relief and curiosity. The young man who had witnessed Maria saving his father's life had become something of an advocate for recognizing service workers throughout their business enterprises. "I've been thinking about the scholarship program," David said, joining them at the table where such formal boundaries had been dissolved. "What if we made it bigger than just one scholarship in Maria's name? What if we created a fund that recognizes people who prepare themselves to serve others, even when that service isn't part of their official job?" Maria looked between father and son, seeing something in their interaction that hadn't existed during the tense family dynamics she had previously observed. The shared experience of crisis and recognition seemed to have created new understanding between them as well. "I appreciate the gesture," Maria said carefully, "but I don't need my name on anything. If you want to help people, just help them. Quietly. The way people like me have always tried to help others." Her response revealed another dimension of her character that Jonathan was learning to recognize, an absence of ego that made her service genuine rather than performative, a focus on results rather than recognition that had enabled her to act decisively during his cardiac episode. The scholarship fund that eventually emerged from these conversations became one of the most innovative recognition programs in the city's service industry history. Rather than celebrating employees who met conventional metrics of success, it identified people who had developed skills beyond their job requirements specifically to help others, who had invested their own resources in expanding their ability to serve. Maria was reluctant to be involved in the program's administration, preferring to return to her regular duties while the Hayes family worked with educational institutions and training organizations to implement the recognition system. But her influence on the program's design was evident in its focus on quiet competence rather than public achievement, on sustained commitment rather than dramatic gesture. The changes at the Grand Metropolitan Hotel itself were more subtle but equally significant. Staff members found themselves treated with increased respect by guests who had heard the story of Jonathan's collapse and Maria's response. The tale had spread through the social networks that connected New York's elite, creating awareness that the people serving them possessed skills, stories, and commitments that extended far beyond their service roles. Maria noticed these changes in how guests interacted with her, but she also observed something more important: how other staff members began to carry themselves with greater pride, how they began to see their work not just as employment, but as a form of service that contained its own dignity and value. Jennifer, who had worked at the hotel for 15 years, described the transformation to Maria during one of their break conversations. "It's like people finally see us as people instead of just part of the furniture. I don't know how long it will last, but right now, it feels different to come to work." The recognition that Maria received extended beyond the hotel itself. Local news outlets continued to follow up on the story, particularly as details emerged about her extensive emergency preparedness and her pattern of quiet intervention in medical crises. But Maria remained reluctant to do interviews, preferring to let others interpret the meaning of what had happened while she focused on her work. The most significant change, however, was in Jonathan himself. His brush with mortality and his education in the hidden dimensions of service had fundamentally altered how he moved through the world. He began to notice the people who cleaned his offices, who maintained the buildings where he conducted business, who provided the countless services that supported his lifestyle. More importantly, he began to interact with them as individuals worthy of recognition and respect. 3 months after his cardiac episode, Jonathan made a decision that surprised everyone who knew him. He arranged to spend a week working alongside the hotel's service staff, not as publicity stunt or condescending gesture, but as genuine attempt to understand the skill, stamina, and emotional intelligence required to provide excellent service to demanding customers. Maria was assigned to train him in breakfast service, a role reversal that both of them found initially awkward but ultimately illuminating. Jonathan discovered that competent service required constant attention, physical endurance, and the ability to manage complex interpersonal dynamics while maintaining professional composure. "I had no idea," he admitted to Maria at the end of his first day, exhaustion evident in every line of his body. "I thought it was just carrying plates and pouring coffee. I didn't realize it was reading people, anticipating needs, managing emotions, yours and theirs." Maria smiled at his revelation, remembering her own early days when she had underestimated the complexity of service work. "Most people don't realize," she said gently. "That's why it stays invisible until something goes wrong." The week of training became a transformation period for Jonathan, showing him not just the technical aspects of service, but the emotional labor involved in caring for others who might not recognize or appreciate that care. He began to understand why Maria's response to his cardiac episode had been so automatic. She had been practicing caring for difficult people every day for years. By the end of his voluntary service week, Jonathan had developed profound respect not just for Maria but for all the people whose work supported his privileged lifestyle. The experience had shown him that true service required a kind of strength and dedication that he had never been required to develop, that the people he had once taken for granted possessed capabilities that extended far beyond their job descriptions. The redemption was complete not because Jonathan had been forgiven, but because he had learned to see. Maria's grace under pressure had saved his life in more ways than medical intervention alone. It had opened his eyes to forms of value and service that existed largely unrecognized in the world he inhabited, had taught him that true dignity came not from wealth or status, but from the choice to care for others, regardless of how that care was received. Standing in that same executive lounge where their story had begun, Jonathan and Maria had both been transformed by their encounter with crisis and its aftermath. The marble floors remained the same. The crystal chandeliers continued to cast their light on morning conversations about investment portfolios and business deals. But something fundamental had changed in the understanding that connected server and served, something that would continue to ripple outward long after their individual story had ended. Maria continued her work with the same quiet competence that had always characterized her service, but she carried with her the knowledge that her dedication had been recognized, that her choice to prepare herself to help others had proved its worth when help was needed most. The recognition didn't change who she was, but it affirmed her faith that choosing to care for others, even difficult others, was never a mistake. The epilogue arrived not with dramatic conclusion, but with the gentle persistence of changed lives continuing their new directions. 1 year after the morning that had transformed both their understanding of service and humanity, Maria Santos and Jonathan Hayes found themselves inhabiting a world that looked the same from the outside, but felt fundamentally different in its daily rhythms and relationships. Maria still worked at the Grand Metropolitan Hotel, but her role had evolved in ways that reflected her full capabilities rather than just her job description. The hotel management had created a new position, Guest Services Emergency Coordinator, that acknowledged her medical training while allowing her to continue the service work she genuinely enjoyed. She spent part of her time training other staff members in emergency response, part of her time continuing her own medical education, and part of her time doing what she had always done, serving guests with the quiet competence that had defined her work from the beginning. The scholarship program that bore her name had awarded its first grants to 12 service industry workers who had demonstrated exceptional commitment to helping others beyond their job requirements. Maria attended the award ceremony reluctantly, still uncomfortable with public recognition, but she was moved by the stories of dedication and service that emerged from careful review of applications. One recipient was a janitor at a major office building who had become a certified EMT and had saved 3 lives during his night shifts over the past 2 years. Another was a hotel housekeeper who had taught herself sign language to better communicate with deaf guests and had become an unofficial interpreter for the entire staff. The common thread among all recipients was the choice to expand their ability to serve others, despite receiving no additional compensation or formal recognition for such efforts. Jonathan's transformation had continued beyond their initial reunion and his week of service training. His business practices had been restructured to include comprehensive emergency training for all employees, recognition programs that celebrated service beyond job descriptions, and benefit packages that supported workers who chose to develop skills that helped others. But perhaps more significantly, Jonathan had become a different kind of person, someone who noticed the people who served him, who understood that true luxury lay not in being waited upon, but in being surrounded by people who chose to care for others. His relationship with his children had improved dramatically, influenced by his new understanding of what it meant to serve others rather than simply being served. David had taken a leadership role in expanding their company's recognition programs, while Jonathan's daughter Emily, previously distant and critical of her father's demanding personality, had begun working with the scholarship program to identify and support service workers who demonstrated exceptional dedication. The Grand Metropolitan Hotel had become something of a model for service industry recognition, with other hotels and restaurants implementing similar programs to identify and celebrate employees who went beyond their job descriptions to care for others. The story of Maria's intervention and Jonathan's transformation had spread throughout the hospitality industry, creating awareness that exceptional service often came from people whose full capabilities were never formally recognized or utilized. But the most significant changes were the smallest ones, visible only to people who had known Maria and Jonathan before their encounter with crisis and redemption. Maria moved through her workdays with increased confidence, not because she had been publicly recognized, but because she had learned that her choices to prepare herself to help others would not go forever unnoticed. She continued her emergency medical training, now with the hotel's financial support, working toward certification as an emergency medical technician while maintaining her service duties. Jonathan continued his morning breakfasts at the hotel, but the conversations that took place at his regular table bore no resemblance to the commanding phone calls about investment portfolios and business deals that had once characterized his presence. Instead, he engaged with Maria and other staff members as fellow human beings, learning about their lives, their goals, and their perspectives on work and service. On the anniversary of his cardiac episode, Jonathan found Maria in the same service corridor where they had reunion a year earlier. The space looked identical, the same fluorescent lighting, the same sounds of hotel operations continuing around them, but both of them carried themselves differently in the familiar environment. "I've been thinking about that morning," Jonathan said, his voice carrying the reflective quality that had replaced his former authoritative tone. "About how different everything could have been if you had made different choices." Maria paused in organizing the supplies she had been distributing to housekeeping staff. "I don't really think about it that way," she said. "I just think about what did happen and how it worked out okay for everyone." Her response illustrated something that Jonathan was still learning to understand about her character. Her focus on results rather than speculation, on moving forward rather than dwelling on alternatives that had never existed. Maria's strength came partly from her refusal to waste energy on regret or resentment, her commitment to dealing with reality as it existed rather than as it might have been. "But I think about it," Jonathan said. "I think about how many people I must have treated badly without ever realizing it, how many opportunities I missed to see the full humanity of people who were serving me. Your choice to save my life gave me the chance to learn to see differently." The conversation continued for several minutes, with both of them reflecting on the year that had passed and the changes that had emerged from their encounter with crisis. They had become unlikely friends, connected not by social compatibility or shared interests, but by the experience of seeing each other clearly in a moment when pretense had been stripped away by emergency. As they talked, other staff members moved through the corridor, many of them now trained in emergency response techniques because of programs that had grown out of Maria's example. The culture of service at the hotel had shifted to include recognition that taking care of guests might sometimes mean literally saving their lives, that true hospitality extended beyond comfort into genuine care for others' well-being. Maria had received job offers from other hotels and restaurants, attracted by her combination of service excellence and emergency medical skills. But she had chosen to stay at the Grand Metropolitan, partly from loyalty to colleagues who had supported her, partly because she had come to see her work as more than employment, as a form of service that contained its own dignity and purpose. "I keep thinking I should move on," she told Jonathan as their conversation drew to a close. "Find something bigger, something that pays better, something that uses all my training." "But you're not going to," Jonathan observed, his tone suggesting understanding rather than question. "No," Maria confirmed. "I like it here. I like the people I work with. I like the guests, even the difficult ones. I like knowing that I can handle whatever comes up, whether it's a special dietary request or someone having a heart attack." Jonathan smiled at her response, recognizing the contentment of someone who had found work that aligned with her values and capabilities. Maria had achieved something that his wealth had never provided. The satisfaction of knowing her daily efforts made a genuine difference in other people's lives. As they prepared to return to their respective duties, Jonathan made one final observation. "You know, when I first met you, I thought service meant getting what I paid for. Now I understand that real service is what you did that morning, choosing to care for someone who hadn't earned it, who didn't deserve it, who had treated you badly. That's not something you can buy. That's something you can only receive from people who choose to give it." Maria nodded. Understanding that Jonathan had learned to recognize the difference between service that came from obligation and service that came from character, between being waited upon and being genuinely cared for by people who had decided that caring for others was part of who they wanted to be. The hotel continued its daily operations around them, with guests arriving and departing, meals being served, rooms being cleaned, and countless small services being provided by people whose names most guests would never learn. But something had changed in the quality of those interactions, influenced by the recognition that each person served and serving carried full humanity worthy of respect and acknowledgement. And have you ever served with your heart and been ignored? Have you ever cared for someone who later forgot you existed? Did you ever give your best to people who treated you as part of the scenery rather than part of the human family? Maria's story reminds us that dignity doesn't depend on recognition. The true service comes from who we choose to be, rather than how we are treated, and that sometimes the greatest transformations begin with someone simply choosing to do what needs to be done when it needs to be done. Tell me your story in the comments below. If Maria's journey moved something in your heart, leave a like and subscribe so this story reaches another quiet hero who deserves to be seen, another person whose daily choices to care for others go unrecognized but not unimportant. For more stories that honor the dignity of service and the strength found in humility, click the podcast link to your left. Thank you for walking this emotional path with us, for recognizing that every person who serves others with genuine care is part of a larger story about what it means to be human. See you in our next story, where we'll continue exploring the extraordinary character that exists in ordinary people who choose to make the world a little better, one small act of service at a time.